Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling. Hi, and welcome back to Neophytes of Narratology. Today we're going to teach you about how to have a proper conversation. I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Scott Thurlow.
Hello there.
And Stephen Ramosi.
Hey, yeah.
Today we are doing a rather famous work by H.P. Grice,
H.R. Geiger,
known as Logic and Conversation, but more recognized as the work where he identified the 4 axioms of proper conversation.
I think you're saying this work is pretty influential within the field.
Yes.
So it's well known within that, and we're going to discuss it shortly.
I would say it's one of the foundations of pragmatics. Well, without further ado, we'll begin. The work starts off with Grice discussing a conflict between two groups that he labels as formalists and informalists. He goes into pretty good depth about what formalists believe, and there are, this is the logicians and the formal semanticists that believe in the logical representation of language and how natural language doesn't really always bend to the will of strict logical language, and how they should really, language should be developed in a way of benefiting science and benefiting, strict assertions and things like that.
Right. Well, that's what the formalists claim.
Yes.
So I have 2 quick quotes, which I'll read shortly, when she sort of lays out the position of each side. The formalist, he says, would like language to be certifiably free from metaphysical implications. And then the informalist will respond that you cannot judge the adequacy of a language and its ability to serve the needs of science. So he sort of lays out the formalists lie on one side of the scale, informalists on the other, and the point of his essay, as broadly we gather, is to sort of tie the two together, sort of bridge the gap between those two mindsets.
I believe, in a sense, the informalists are more of the anti-formalists than
yes,
a unified group, as Grice describes them.
As often philosophical camps group form within this.
And in a way, I'm going to describe this as an old Western, where Grice is the sheriff coming to town. He understands that
it's a good analogy.
Natural language is considered, in a way, a Wild West, but he's going to bring law and order to one aspect of it, which is how conversations work. And he's going to apply, in a sense, not strict logic to it, but in kind of a way to both make the formalists and informalists maybe not happy about it, but a way to, as you said, bridge the gap.
Yeah, incorporate both, at least aspects of both schools of thought. And also, if we're doing a funny logline, as we normally do on other shows, I had it for this one. It's, if anyone is familiar with the Implications episode of Always Sunny, this is Implication, exclamation, the essay. That's all I wanted to slip in. Now go on to an actual academic analysis.
Well, I was going to bring up that it kind of seems like he thinks that these should meet somewhere in the middle, or perhaps they even do if you're really paying attention. He says there
might be a hidden Venn diagram between them.
Right. He says the real difference in their positions arises from an inadequate attention to the nature and importance of the conditions governing conversation. So it kind of seems like, to him, in my mind, when I was reading this, it seems like these two positions are attacking the same problem from very different
opposite angles,
from very different very different angles, but there's not as much different between them as they may think.
On the surface, it seems. Sure.
You can abide, if you can't abide by strict logic, you can still abide by rules.
Right.
And the rest of the work is
him laying out the rules he thinks apply to such.
Oddly enough, a very specific aspect of language.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of the introduction. And he goes into, he titles it Implicature, but it's the entire rest of the work here.
Yeah.
Which is,
like I said, so many implications. The note I have, like he's going to use that term variously to invoke his point here.
So, what you really have to understand is what an implicature is. It's kind of linked to a presupposition, whereas a presupposition is kind of what you expect your audience to know. It's in
the knowledge
sense,
that you have and that they have and that you agree, like, or sort of tautologically presuppose exists there in that space.
Yeah, but the implicature is more of a two-way street in that aspect.
Yes,
if not more on the audience than on the speaker, necessarily. And it's what arises from what is said by a speaker and what is implied by the use of language. And it can go from very innocent things to very in-depth kind of ambiguities, which we'll explore in full later. That's where it's kind of beginning with. Do you guys have any... and also, I shall add this one last part. A lot of it comes into context.
Yes, I was waiting for... the
situation of when it's said. Also, body language, tone of voice, things like that add to the... not just the strict logical statement that is made, but everything else that is attached to it.
I will say this. At this point, shortly, I believe, after he starts the implicature section, which is everything else, he does lay out a couple of definitions which are important to this.
Good point.
Implicature, which we have been saying, is to him implying, whereas implicatum is what is implied.
It's like a noun of to implicate.
And those are, especially if you're going to read this, I mean, we're probably going to break this down so that you know what that means every time we say it to some extent. But it's important to know those definitions going into this paper because he uses both those terms a lot. And if you don't know what they mean, you're going to be a little bit lost.
That's sort of the whole point of him, like, even mentioning it. And you're right. Like, it's an important thing to keep in mind, in light of what he's going to lay forth going forward.
So one of the examples he initially starts out with is the sentence, "He is in the grip of a vice," which I imagine at the time he was writing this, and I'm gathered he's British from a lot of the references he makes in this. That might have been a better known saying, but you could either
I mean, it's
use
not unknown. It's less prevalent nowadays. Sure.
So I understand what the intent of it is, but he said that you can, depending on the context of the situation, a person is either, like the sentence strictly says that if you say he's in the grip of a vice, that means that the person or object of what you say is literally in the grip of a vice. But that is not what is implied by
what is usually meant by such a statement.
Sure. So in a sense, he goes into... He's starting off with slang in conversation as his first major example.
No, kind of. And you just brought it up. I thought it was important. If you didn't do it, I was going to. That this is sort of, this entire essay is sort of filtered through the angle of context. Like, it's an important thing. Like, it's context, if you will, allow me this, is almost presupposed as well within everything he's about to say and the examples and the rules he's about to break down for this one little subtopic of linguistics that he's going to cover.
But I think he's using these and the other examples in this particular opening to give examples of what he's talking about the idea that context does matter.
For sure. And they're well-chosen examples, I will say.
So are you going to go further into the vice thing? Because I think there's an important distinction here to be made, that when he says in the grip of whoever was in the grip of a vice, he was in the grip of a vice, it's all about the context that comes out of this, because vice can mean a tool that is used to hold things, or some bad habit.
Yes. And
he makes it clear, depending on the context, it can theoretically mean either one of those, or it can be like a metaphor for he's in a bad situation, and that's used as though it was a vice holding him there or something like that.
And what he uses the term the use of a sentence in strictly speaking, which will, like, logicians.
It's almost like literal, like the overuse of literal, kind of. I think you might.
What I think he's suggesting here is that some logicians and semanticists have very strict truth values on how they assess sentences, and that if you want to say someone is in the grip of a vice in a metaphorical way, it's not a false statement simply because he is not
literally
or strictly speaking.
It becomes a slippery slope, but I certainly see what you're saying and what he's trying to get at too.
I think this section is more of him establishing where he's going to be going.
It's still more of a preface, a preamble, if you will. But I mean, he sets up what he's going to sort of delve into as it follows from that.
Right.
Then I think is really where he gets, the next section is where he really starts beginning his discussion on the fundamental aspects of conversation. And he starts off with the cooperative principle.
Right.
And this is kind of statement that in general, he does give counterexamples to this as it goes along.
This is like almost like his overriding maxim that other maxims will follow from.
But in general, when you go into a conversation, it's an act of cooperation. As this, you go in there and you're expecting certain things from a conversation.
It already has a sort of a preset of values attached to it, in the loosest sense of the term values.
And that will be later built upon, as you mentioned, in his 4 major maxims. But this is, it really is. It's not, you don't expect someone to come in trying to con you of something or giving false statements just for the sake of giving false statements, or like there's a certain level of,
participation kind of mutually.
And good faith on both sides in a conversation.
I think, I believe I don't have the quote picked out in front of me, but he mentions just briefly, just before this, that at the end of the day, something like the situation in which he's talking about and the various sub-situations, if you will, from them sort of involve an exchange of information, and as you said, a two-way street. So again, you sort of have to presuppose that in order to follow from what he's going to break down, is all.
And I mean, there certainly are people I have met in my time who assume that every conversation they go into, the other person is lying into them or has ill intent. Or
aren't you that person?
No, I go in with enough good.
Maybe I'm that person.
But there are that wouldn't be an unpleasant existence to have, just doubting.
Yes, I know
this. The cooperative principle. So I actually have to say I very much agree with, at least on you can go into debates or you could like being the
but those,
devil's advocate, but those are
contextual situations and conversations, if you will,
and go against what his what he a counterexample that he will admit to.
Right.
So based on these, based on the cooperative principle, Grice develops 4 maxims, which this is his I think the most important thing, or what the average person who studies or is familiar with Grice will associate him with, are these 4 maxims of conversation, which I will read out right now. It's quantity, quality, relation, and manner, which he gives a nod to Kant for inspiring him on.
Yeah, I think this is really the meat and potatoes of the entire essay. This part is really what was for me the most interesting part, and going through his maxims and then all of the examples, that he gives sort of shortly thereafter.
Right, yeah, it's almost like the cornerstone of his argument. He built upon these, and then we'll sort of diverge from them, sort of have not a bracket, you break down like the food groups, you have one thing up here and then 2 arrows split off, etc. So yeah, but these 4 main ones is what he's going to use to explore further.
All right. Normally, I don't enjoy reading straight from the text, except for choice quotes, but to obey Grice's own kind of maxims here, he writes them very succinctly, and I don't think there's a better way to describe them without betraying the maxims of conversation.
No, I quite liked. I was unfamiliar with him, and so you suggested this, and as I went through, I'm like, his writing style is, as you said, it's succinct and also very clear to the point. Maybe Steve-O might have a different opinion as we go on. But at least for this one section, when he lays out his 4 little ground rules, and here's the sort of measuring stick that I'm going to use as I go on, and I think they were pretty solid. I couldn't think of anything to replace them with, really. I
absolutely agree with that. This is by far, to me, the most clear part of this essay, and the part that is actually going to stick with me, I think, the most of everything else that he talks about.
As I said, this is what has stuck the most with people throughout time. So quantity starts off with basically 2 principles to it. 1, make your contribution as informative as is required for the current purposes of the exchange. And 2, do not make your contribution more informative than is required. Now, I do want to interrupt for a moment. That's basically the principle, axiom of quantity, but I want to interrupt for a moment. He later on, or I think very shortly, states that he's basically codifying the trivial, With this, if you
which is an amazing phrase as well.
Yes.
I think he does say that outright.
And the thing is, these are all like points where you read them and are like, huh, that's interesting. That's how conversation works. But again, no one had tackled it before, and he's again codifying it, and that's why I think it's strong. But nonetheless, I'll move on to the.
Just real quickly, so if I want to rephrase them, and this is something we've mentioned on like our Bon Mott reviews and so forth, the first rule basically says don't exposition dump, more or less.
Oh, don't give too little, don't give too much.
Right.
Sure, you have to give enough information, but over the line, like number 2, essentially underneath that would be that.
And he does say that the second part is disputable. That don't give too much information is disputable depending on context and stuff
context,
like that.
of course, sure.
But yeah, anyway, so going to quality.
So quality, again, has 2 parts to it, which he broadly states, try to make your contribution one that is true. So this is do not say what you believe to be false, and 2 is do not say that for which you lack adequate evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Which
that's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
I would say.
I would say that most people probably break the
Violate
second part of that one.
Yes,
but
especially nowadays,
especially us doing this show. But the third one is relation, which doesn't have sectionals, but
a single maxim.
Yeah, be relevant. There's interesting. I want to give so I took an advertising of language or language of advertising class, which we were doing with like the idea of cross culture, and how the fact that like Japanese commercials, for instance, make no sense to Americans, and does cultural context betray the maxim of relevance?
I think it might. Like, yeah, it surely can.
Well, if this commercial can be said to be in conversation with an American audience, then yes, I would say so. But certainly, it wasn't intended to be in that conversation. It was intended to be in a conversation with a Japanese audience.
Sure, and I think like yes, relation is like a consideration, but I think he admits himself that it's the most vague one. It's the most like sort of amorphous one, because I believe, if not in this section, like shortly after, he'll say when he's delving into it further that the conversations can flow. So topics can be legitimately changed and so forth. So therefore, relativeness is going to like flow itself within the flow of the conversation at large.
He does say that right after, and he also says, I hope to revert back to this in a later work. So clearly he had more to say about it.
Sure.
And the fourth and final one is perhaps the most British of them all, which is manners.
Well, just manner per se, but it includes that.
1, avoid obscurity of expression. 2, avoid ambiguity. 3, be brief. And 4, be orderly. So, yeah. That one I'm kind of
iffy about.
What, be orderly? Or all of these?
I guess this is, like, the idea is that the previous 3 maxims kind of have an overarching aspect to all conversation. 4, I guess you have specific manner within certain subcultures. You would act differently amongst your friends than you do amongst your family, perhaps. Sure. But I don't know. To me, that one.
So I mean, I do like the fact that he gives examples for a lot of this stuff, and shortly afterwards, if you don't mind, I'll just read these examples because you might have been going to do that anyway, Ian. But I think they clarify in real terms a lot of what this is about. So like. He gives these examples. So for quantity, if you are assisting me to mend a car, I expect your contribution to be neither more nor less than is required. If, for example, at a particular stage I need 4 screws, I expect you to hand me 4 rather than 2 or 6. Quality, I expect your contributions to be genuine and not spurious. If I need sugar as an ingredient in the cake, I do not expect you to hand me salt. If I need a spoon, I do not expect a trick spoon made of rubber. Relation, I expect a partner's contribution to be appropriate to immediate needs at each stage of the transaction. If I am mixing ingredients for a cake, I do not expect to be handed a good book or even an oven cloth. Though, parentheses, I think this might be the most British thing he does the entire time. Though this might be an appropriate contribution at a later stage.
Well, it's one of the most British things.
He has to apologize for that may work out later.
It could be relevant in your manners.
And then manner, I expect a partner to make it clear what contribution he is making and to execute his performance with reasonable dispatch, which I think is reasonable to expect from a conversation, even though it's a little bit unsure. Or I would say the manner part is the most unsure of all of these.
Yes, that's exactly the point I was going to raise. So the 4 things you just read out under manner E, they can almost be cut up and folded into the previous 3. At least that's how I thought of it. Like manner is like another fluid thing. And to what the examples you just read, Steve-O, hand me 4 screws and not 6 or whatever, that's not quite conversation. Like, I took umbrage with that little example. You know what I mean? Like, oh, give me the flower and not a almond glove. Okay, but like
he's not trying to make an exact. He's not trying to say this is what it would be in conversation. It's just like, this is an example of what this means, you know?
Right, I get it. But like, I thought he could have chosen better examples given in light of the examples what we mentioned previously and probably will mention going forward. It's just that this one seems the most obscure, like not obscure, amorphous again to me. Like manner. Like you said, yeah, it's completely fucking British. You guys are so British. Sure. And like, of course, manner matters to the conversation you're having. I just think it's more ill-defined than the others.
He also does a quick one-off sentence right after describing the 4 races, and one might need others.
Yes, I was hoping someone pointed that out too.
That's
exactly.
Right.
But sure, but broadly, it's under his main 4 banners, so we can accept that.
So between what Steve-O wrote out and what I read out and what I read earlier, he has a kind of discussion over other types of maxims that might apply, which ones do have precedence over others, but I think that we really covered what is important about this section, at least. So, before mentioned the codification of the trivial, and this is where he's going into it, which he says that conversations are almost a quasi-contractual matter.
Yes, which I liked. I like that phrase.
Yeah. It's reiterating points he made earlier, but this time with a more heavier focus on that there's expectations in having a conversation. Actually, he has a good example of that with, if my car is broken down on the side of the road and I see a car driving towards me, there's an expectation of them pulling over and stopping to help me. But if someone does stop over to help me, my expectation is far greater to their ability to help me.
Well, it changes to a different degree, yeah.
And there's one final part that I like about this, where he says, in the absence of indications that you are merely an incompetent meddler.
Yes, which is another British thing to say.
But certainly has been the case for all of us at one point or another in our lives.
Sure, yeah.
Some incompetent meddler has come along.
Or maybe sometimes you were the incompetent meddler, but certainly it has happened.
I have been a meddler, but never an incompetent one.
Well, not yet. But maybe right. It's even though that's humorous, like he does point out, it's another situation in which you have to consider again the context of the interaction of the conversation in a two-way street.
All right, now I want to get your guys' opinion of this, which is kind of a follow-up to what he was saying. Anyone who cares about the goals that are central to conversation/communication must be expected to have an interest, given suitable circumstances, in participation in talk exchanges that will be profitable only on the assumption that they are conducted in general accordance with the CP and the Maxims.
Do I agree with that?
Thank you.
What are you asking?
I guess here is now a good time to have the discussion over whether meaningful conversations can only be had when obeying these rules that he set up.
Well, if I'm to answer first, I would say not always. Like, largely, yes. I'm trying to think how I should exactly phrase it, if you will. If not ironically, even though he brings up irony later. Like, yeah, I think there's a base level in which some low percentage of that must hold true in order for that condition to be satisfied. Otherwise, it's not a conversation, communication even at all. Or if it is, it's a failure or a lack thereof.
I would say that someone can break one of these maxims and still have a meaningful conversation.
Well, he brings that up too.
Hold on. Except for perhaps the relation maxim. At the point where something is not relevant, I don't know if that conversation is helpful. But I think if you break more than one of these, quantity, quality, relation, and manner, just to some extent, you're, if not completely pointless as far as conversation goes, at that point, you're spiraling towards it very quickly.
I like that.
So I don't think that you necessarily have to follow all of these at all times. But that in the same, like that's kind of what I love about language is I'm sure there is a case where you could break almost all of these rules and still have an interesting conversation.
So about the relevance one, I think this is not done by Grice, so it must have been in my class. they're talking about how two coworkers are having a discussion about how hot their boss is, and one sees her approaching and the other one's going on loudly, like at a Christmas party about it. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden the other guy breaks the conversational relevance rule by starting to talk even louder about something totally off topic for the purpose of saving the other person's job, which is breaking a rule of the conversation, but for the relevance section.
I would argue that is relevant to the party who is talking that is about to get in trouble, though. I would argue that is still relevant. It all, like this entire paper says, everything is about implications and the context in which we receive these conversations. So if something is irrelevant, then either it is not understood by one of the parties or is unimportant to at least one of the parties. And I think that if that's the case, then the conversation kind of loses meaning. But in that case that you just brought up, there is very much importance to what is being said by the other coworker, and if the other person catches on, or even if they don't catch on but start talking about whatever that other person changes the conversation to, then that is very relevant to them and their situation and their context.
No, you're right. Again, it's always situational, contextual in that sense. But I think if the CP is being still like broadly obeyed by both parties, then certainly you can break one or more of the sub 4 rules, and it will, because of the situation again in context, then it'll be like a meta breaking thing. You're breaking one, but in order to like achieve a greater goal of another one, of the greater CP at large.
So now that we discussed breaking the rules, let's go into depth with what Grice is talking about. So he establishes 4 types of how the maxims are broken. The first is what I gather is an unintentional violation, as he calls it, of a rule. The other is a purposeful opting out, which he uses an example of if someone asks a person for information and that person knows the answer but cannot give it, they go, my lips are sealed, I can't say any more. Like, that is a willful but
an acknowledgement of withdrawal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
The other one is a clash, when I've actually come across a situation where
I couldn't wait for you to talk about this one.
Someone presses you to the example he gives is be as informative. The quantity maxim, which is being as informative as possible, will clash with the quality, which is having adequate evidence of what you're about to say. So I've been presented with, what do you think? Well, I don't know enough to give something I'm confident has a truth value of 1.
There's an unstoppable object immovable force at play here in conversation.
And then the fourth, and I think the most important for this rest of the paper, is the flouting of a maxim, which is funny because he will capitalize different sentences, like a YouTube comment. Yeah. I'll have something right. So he has flout, blatantly, and exploited, all capitalized in the same paragraph here. But basically, using maxims on a purpose to obscure and make something ambiguous. There's 1,000 reasons to flout a maxim in conversation.
Well, he does give some good examples here of flouted quality maxims, and all of them really interesting and very important to having a an in-depth conversation with somebody. The first is irony. So using irony.
I was waiting for someone to touch on
his
that.
example is X is a fine friend. Obviously, that person means that the opposite is true. Like,
in the context.
In the proper context, like, oh, that's a fine thing to do to somebody or whatever. Metaphor, in which you call something other than it actually is. Using a metaphor is basically lying, but, to a purpose and to draw a comparison. Meiosis, and what he says here, this is really short section. So he's of a man known to have broken up all the furniture. One says he was a little intoxicated. And then hyperbole.
My favorite one, of course.
Yes, of course. Grouping grouping everything together as though it's all the same. So every nice girl loves a sailor or something like that. So those are 4 interesting examples of how you can flout the maxims that we've been using.
And we'll actually come back to this section in depth because I just want to finish up what the last part of this sentence is. But that great example is Steve-O, which the final part of the Implicature area was dealing with conversational implicatures and how they functionally work in conversations, how for your implication to, as a speaker, to get across, the other person has to be able to work out what you're implying, and and different little levels of this. But I think what's more interesting are the examples of the flouting, which we'll go into next. So he starts off with discussing what are assertions, what are types of speech that don't flout maxims,
Right.
And then he goes into this. So, Scott, would you like to read off the part about the quantity?
You want Group A?
Yes. You don't have to read the whole thing, but just summarize 1A.
So his example here is the flouting of the first maxim of quantity. A is writing a testimonial about a pupil who is a candidate for a philosophy job. His letter reads as follows. Dear Sir or Madam, X's, the subject's command of English is excellent, and his attendance at tutorials has been regular. Yours, etc. Now, he cannot be unable through ignorance to say more, since the subject in question is his pupil. Moreover, he knows that more information than this is wanted. He must therefore be wishing to impart some information that he is reluctant to write down. This supposition is tenable only on the assumption that he thinks the subject, Mr. X, is no good at philosophy. This, then, is the implication here. Yes, I quite like that example. You're right. It's almost like it's implication by omission, if you will. Or misdirection, perhaps.
There's another interesting one, kind of almost the opposite, where you're saying a lot of things by not saying, which is
exactly.
And here's one that he gives an example of war is war and women are women, but there's a very famous one. It is what it is nowadays.
Yes,
which
God, do I hate that saying?
It's really weird. Some people like that saying. I don't mind it, but there's people who, like Scott here, who vehemently despise it. But it really does say a lot without saying anything.
I mean, it can, sure. I mean, I like his phrasings real quickly. I like Grice's utterances of patent tautologies, as if they're so dried and worn out. But that's how, you're right. That is how I feel about some of them, especially that one. So.
But their use, at this point, is raised over a tautology. Surely you know what someone means when they say it is what it is.
You're right.
And they don't mean that this thing is this thing.
Implications.
You're absolutely right, Steve-O. Sure, I don't have to like the use of that phrase, but I mean, I know what it's supposed to signify.
Yeah. I already did the quality ones.
Yes.
The flouting of the quality.
So, so I'm going to move on to relation for a second, which Steve-O had brought up earlier as his most, what he thought was, in a sense, the maxim that is not most important, but is most
hardest to violate, I suppose.
Yes, that's a good way of saying it.
But he does it right here.
So person A says Mrs. X is an old bag, and then person B says, "My, the weather has been quite delightful this summer, hasn't it?" Which is the use of a statement to avoid a conversation that you find uncomfortable.
It's purposefully invoking irrelevance, if you will, but for a different, a purpose beyond that.
I still see that to be relevant to the situation, though.
But that's actually completely different than the one I gave earlier, because that it's more of where the first one, which was the Christmas party, was relevant to both speakers.
Which,
this is only relevant to the hearer trying to back out of a conversation.
Right.
Sure. But no, it is also relevant to whoever else is in attendance, right? This normally probably wouldn't, I mean, perhaps it would be said just between the two of them, but a lot of times something like this is said to make everyone else feel in the area feel more comfortable. And I feel that it's relevant to all of them, to anyone else who's in attendance of this conversation.
That's actually quite interesting. You're right about that. I mean, it could be both in a sense, right? It could be between speaker A and B with no audiences, with no surrounding NPCs, if you will. Or it could be for their sake, in order to avoid a perhaps undesirable conversation.
Right.
And you're right. So, but the example that you gave E earlier about the office thing, that's not in this paper. You were saying it's from your class, although it is similar and related for sure. And again, my only point to say is that it all comes back down to context and situational awareness. Of course, you're right. It could be that, Steve-O, and in fact, that situation probably is.
And what I would also say is that this is relevant to the other person in the conversation specifically because it says, without saying, I don't want to talk about this, it says, I don't want to talk about
exactly.
this.
That's right. That's
perfectly
said.
You couldn't say it more, obviously if you had just said those words.
In fact, if you did say that, if you say, we shouldn't talk about this or I'm appalled about that, it's almost more...
That's perhaps more breaking
I don't want to say more insulting,
rules.
but it's more effective if you say, well, look at that car, isn't that nice? Yeah, or whatever. Yeah,
Exactly.
Less British.
yes, well, true. You're right about
Oh, have a lovely day.
the British man is. This cup of tea is lovely.
So he goes on to the types such ambiguity and obscurity,
Mm.
which is both where you're dealing with like poetry and, in a sense, purposeful ambiguity.
Double
There's actually-
entendres.
Yeah, there's a very famous example that I always thought was funny, which a British general captured the town of Sind, Sind,
Oh yeah.
and wrote back the message to his officers that I have sinned, and as a joke, but the use of like humor and kind of to both convey a message, but also
Yeah,
to
it's
be
sort of like a
ambiguous.
pun, kind of, but sure. I mean, it matters to this.
Certainly worked better if there was a telegraph operator on the other end taking
Yeah,
down
well, I
the
think
message.
I think Grice
know?
does bring that up as at least as a possible situation. But you're right. I mean, it's amusing and funny, but still relevant to his point.
And then the other part's obscurity. Steele Scott and I had a conversation about this earlier, which the idea of where he actually gives having a conversation in front of a child where you don't want to say a specific thing. We added into trying to say about like doing Christmas presents and not telling a child that Santa Claus doesn't exist for any children listening right now. And
That Santa Claus does not exist.
Just ruin your dreams. 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds. Who knows?
listening to Grice.
Listening to this podcast about
You got to start
Grice.
somewhere, man. Listen, children are our future. So, given that, realize there's no Santa Claus.
But yeah, you don't want to directly state that to them, so you will
Talk around it, sort of, yeah.
and use purposeful obscurity, but still not violating the maxims of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So there is also this is a very famous example too, which is a review of or using too much information.
This one's
to
reminding me of
drive home a
Citizen
point.
Kane, by the way, for some reason. But go on, read it
Where
out.
Someone sings a song in the review, puts out that Miss X produced a series of sounds that correspond closely with the score of Home Sweet Home, which says everything and saying too much.
See, again, like, depending on context, you take it both ways. If we're going back to the formalist way of phrasing it, like, yeah, that's probably what happened. But he points out, Grice, that is the verb sing implies like sort of one thing automatically, where if you describe it as something else than that, then
Right.
it takes on it, of course, the implication that you want it to have.
I would say there's almost no context in which this is not making fun of the person that's
Unless you're like
attempting to sing.
purposefully literal. about
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
If like Dax from Guardians or something, but anyway.
So this finishes the fun part of Grice's work. Well, there's this last 2.5 pages where he goes over the rules of conversational implicatures, which is where so far in this work he has been very straightforward in what he's.
This is the
been
most,
saying.
if not metaphysical, but like something like that, like abstract. Yes,
is the best way to put it.
yes, exactly.
There's honestly sections of this that I had to read several times in order to fully grasp what he's trying to say, but it's dealing with a lot of things of saying that X is meeting a woman this evening implies that it's not his wife or his sister or mother or a close relation. It's probably scandalous. I'm going to build off that, but X is meeting his woman this evening has a completely different interpretation, of course, using direct and indirect. And it's basically a lot of like a versus the and using like genitive pronouns versus kind of the other types of abstract. And that there's a heavy amount of implication that goes into that, especially in the choice of words that the speaker uses and how the listener interprets it.
For sure, yeah. Like, as we just said, it's definitely the most abstract sort of, if not obtuse, but sort of less focused, we'll say, than previous. But I would like to read out one line that sort of like, he's like, just drops in there, sort of lumps in all this, that I quite liked. He says, information, like money, is often given without the giver's knowing to just what use the recipient will want to put it. Like, I thought that was quite good, even though it's, again, sort of like randomly dropped in there with all this other stuff that he sort of like sort of crams in at the closing of this essay.
But there's a lot here. So I'm going to give another example of this, which I think actually I'm going to build off of what I think he's trying to say and maybe hopefully word it better than he did.
All right.
So
One up,
Grice. Examples of usage. Like I have been sitting in a car all morning, and I broke a finger yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
I have been sitting in a car all morning instead of I've been sitting in my car all morning, which he doesn't have the my car part, but I think that's the point he's trying to say.
It's a difference. Yeah, I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah. It has a different level of implication there versus I broke a finger has the same level of implication that I broke my finger.
Right.
Right.
Where it would, if I told you I broke a finger yesterday, like, oh, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. I broke someone else's finger.
Yes.
That would be a shocking twist on that statement. And then he goes into the rules of how these conversational implicatures work, which the first one is that it has to fit in with the cooperative principle that he has built everything upon. The second part is actually a kind of tricky concept, which is the non-detachability feature.
Yes.
So I've decided, for the sake of not speaking about what we don't know and following Grice's own rule maxims, to just read 2 through 5. Be quick. And you can judge with Grice's own words what is implied by these words together. Insofar as the calculation that a particular conversational implicature is present requires, besides contextual and background information, only a knowledge of what has been said or of the conventional commitment of the utterance, insofar as the manner of expression plays no role in the calculation, it will not be possible to find another way of saying the same thing which simply lacks the implicature in question, except where some special feature of the substituted version is itself relevant to the determination of an implicature in virtue of one of the maxims of manner. If we call this feature nondetachability, one may expect a generalized conversational implicature that is carried by a familiar non-special locution to have a high degree of non-detachability.
Sure. I mean, I think I know what he's getting at, but don't really want to delve into it too deeply.
If I have to take a stab at it, it's stating that a good implicature requires no outside information beyond what is present in the conversation.
Kind of. I can certainly agree with that, and perhaps it's what he's getting at. Maybe it's unfolded into. What I take it as, if you have implicature that you want to get across in mind, there is one and only way to say it this way without changing it itself, and that's the in quotes non-detachability. You must phrase it and or present it in such a way to get across the implicature you want. Otherwise, it loses it.
Yeah, you can't just go into a he without establishing prior the...
Except where some special feature of the substituted version is itself relevant.
Unless it's a... all right, think of it this way.
This is where I got hung up on this one. It says, it will not be possible to find another way of saying the same thing, which simply lacks the implicature in question, except where some special feature of the substitute version is itself relevant to the determination of an implicature. Which I don't...
Think of it this way.
Really?
I think I got it, Siva.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so I don't have a specific example, but you can say the same thing, but the manner he brings up, tone of voice. So, how's it going, eh? Or just like, how's it going, huh? Like, it's something like that, in which... That's how I got out of it. That's not the best example. I understand that.
Shh.
But it's something like similar to... That's what I extracted from this number 2 here at the end of this.
I don't know. I get hung up on the fact that he says it will not be possible.
I understand.
And then follows it up with saying, except where some special feature of the substitute version is itself relevant.
Yeah, it's... All right. How about this?
I feel like I know that there's got to be a way to read this where it will be obvious what is happening. But I read over this second part of this probably 5 times, and I just don't. It seems like it's obtuse for the reason of being obtuse. Like it just seems difficult to understand because he wanted to be hard to understand.
It's Bartzian.
I don't know about that.
So.
It could almost be like an inside joke, I guess, would be my example. And there are once an inside joke is established, that the participants have the information in the context to extract that, then you can phrase that inside joke differently, and
Perhaps.
It will be slightly different. I guess that's the best example.
So it's only possible to break from what you're trying to, from the
it's like a
literal
meta thing.
version of what you're trying to say if you have context with another person that you're in conversation with.
So think of it that way. Maybe that's sort of what I got out of it.
Maybe that's what it means.
That's all I got, though.
Confused? Well, we have more. 3. To speak approximately, since the calculation of the presence of conversational implicature presupposes an initial knowledge of the conventional form of the expression, the utterance of which carries the implicature, a conversational implicatum will be a condition that is not included in the original specification of the expression's conventional force, though it may not be impossible for what starts life, so to speak, as a conversational implicature to become a conventionalized, to become conventionalized. To suppose that it is so in a given case would require special justification. So initially, at least, a conversational implicata are not part of the meaning of the expressions to the employment of which they attach.
I think it's even more vague. Exactly what you said about number 2, Steve-O, is what I extracted from this one.
I got this
I have
one
no
a little
example.
bit more.
All right, so you tell me what it is.
Well, what I wrote down for this when I was reading it was, what is implied is not necessarily part of the meaning of their expression, of its expressions.
Okay.
So what you're saying does not necessarily mean what you imply.
Right. Okay. All right. I guess that...
You know, like the literal definition of what you're saying does not necessarily mean what is implied in the sentence.
So like tough titties. Like
Sure.
idioms, I guess. No, I mean, that's funny. I guess you're right. Like, so then, again, to mirror what you just said, how come Grice didn't just say that in this section?
I wish he had.
Anyways.
But wait, there's more.
Much more.
4. Since the truth of the conversational implicatum is not required by the truth of what is said may be true, what is implicated may be false, the implicature is not carried by what is said, but only by the saying of what is said, or by putting it that way.
Yeah, that one's actually fine.
Yes.
This was one of the clearest ones to me. By basically the idea that the content of the conversation can be true, while its implications can be false. Right?
Yeah.
Did you guys read that basically the same way?
Yes.
Okay.
Like I said, that was the most clearest one, and like we could probably think of funny examples of putting it that way that would exemplify this, but it was very clear regardless on face value.
Well, let me put 5 this way. Since to calculate a conversational implicature is to calculate what has to be supposed in order to preserve the supposition that the cooperative principle is being observed, and since there may be various possible specific explanations, a list of which may be open, the conversational implicatum in such cases will be disjunction of such specific explanations, and if the list of these is open, the implicatum will have just the kind of indeterminacy that many actual implicata do in fact seem to possess.
Yeah.
Finn.
Meta levels of vagary there.
I actually wrote down on the last one. So I said that 2 was the one that I didn't understand, but on the 5th one I wrote, no idea what the point of this is.
Maybe that's the point.
So maybe, I don't know if either of you can clear that up for me at all, but I just didn't get this last part.
I'll say this about it. I don't know if this is like answering what you want or even if it's what he's trying to get at, but the last sentence I think is the most important to me. Like it sort of sums it up, where the implicatum will have just the kind of indeterminacy that many actual implicata do in fact seem to possess. So it's like you want to imply something and it'll be just vague enough that it'll hold true or not, like in a weird like gray area.
What I gather is that inherently implicatures are ambiguous.
Yep.
So
sure.
There are multiple interpretations
because of that fact, right?
To that. So
what does an open list here imply?
A way of like when I say a sentence that has an implicature, I am not using just the closed, definite description of what that like tough. Yeah. When I say tough titties, as you brought up earlier, I am not literally suggesting that they're somewhere in the vicinity.
Yes. Yeah, no, like I said, like, again, like, it's vague enough, but I think at the end of the day, that's what he's trying to get at, Steve. Well, again, the best way I can answer you, and if he maybe, like, back me up, or at least, are we agreeing upon a broad basis of that?
I think the implications of what he's saying, I think we're agreeing upon.
Yes. And I certainly agree with all implications.
But if anyone wishes to,
if you have another thing to say, or drop us a note
on the subject, comment, show off to the YouTube community about your knowledge of Grice, engage us in a conversation, We're sure to flout a few maxims here and there, but overall we'll probably be coherent of sorts.
Prove us wrong and ship us the conversational
We'll certainly
Implicature.
try.
All right. Anyone else have anything to say? Okay. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, codifier of the Trivial, here with Stephen Ramosi
Have a good night.
and Scott Thurlow.
And I flout all conversational maxims ever. Good night.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course. Music by Christopher Morgan. Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow.